Generally speaking, foreign policy has been an area of strength for the Labour Party, and it's not really one of those years where you can point to many great strengths.
In the 70s and 80s, we were spending around 4% of GDP on both on health and defence. Now we're at around 8 to 9% of GDP on health, and the one thing the government has said that it will spend more on is defence.
The Chancellor is in a very, very difficult position in that she has these fiscal rules in place, which mean that she either has to cut spending or increase taxes.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. A year ago, Labour swept to power with a landslide victory that ended 14 years in opposition. They promised a new era of delivery and stability. Where are we now? Well, it is a very good question. We're recording this after an extraordinary week in Parliament, which has seen the Chancellor weeping on camera behind the Prime Minister while he did not, at that point, commit to her staying in her job for a long time, though he has now done that, and the bond markets then fell, though they rose a bit when he did issue the qualified endorsement that he eventually produced, saying that she would be there for a very long time. They were afraid that a more left-wing chancellor might emerge and that Britain's fiscal rules would be thrown out the window. So we're here to discuss all kinds of things. We are certainly going to talk about the foreign policy and the successes that the government has had there, but also come round to its economic policy, whether it can get the growth that the Chancellor has been trying so hard to get, and indeed to that bigger question of whether Britain is governable, whether any government can get the public or its own party to agree with the choices that must be made. So we have all that, but what an extraordinary year it has been. I've got a terrific trio to discuss all this. Olivia Sullivan, who runs our UK and the World project, Stephen Millard and Joe Twyman. Welcome to you all. Let's kick right off with this first question of abroad, a long way from the drama in Westminster this week. Olivia, what do you make of what the government and Keir Starmer have done on the world stage?
Well, they certainly have a tough environment overseas as well. If you think about the last time Labour were in power, some of the key pillars of UK foreign policy that were more certain then, the security relationship with the US, the UK's position in the EU, the position of China in the world, all of those relationships and ties have significantly shifted for this period of Labour in government. But Starmer and his administration have had some relatively good tactical successes in terms of managing each of those ties. I don't think anyone would argue that Starmer's done a pretty good job of managing specifically the relationship with Trump as a person. That's yielded some short-term tariff relief, not on all of them, but something of a deal.
He's kept on side a bit to the astonishment of his own team, but he has managed to keep on side with Donald Trump where some European leaders have found it harder.
Yeah, they seem almost surprised by the sort of residual affection Trump seems to have for the UK, which might come from his ancestral links or the fact that he likes the grandeur of the royal family. But there's a sense from this government that we might as well play all of the cards that we've got in terms of keeping this relationship on track, and that's yielded some of those benefits in terms of tariff relief, but it's also meant the UK has been able to work in a relatively coordinated, relatively successful way with European leaders in terms of trying to get the US to have a more clear-eyed view of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, although we'll have to see over time how that works out. On Europe, some good first steps on reducing trade barriers for food and food products, and some new thinking about working together on security and defence, especially defence spending and planning, which Europe badly needs to do. We all share the security risks around Russia. And on China, a very similar approach to other countries in a similar position, other European leaders. They're trying to balance managing the risks with the type of engagement and visits that we've seen other European leaders do. But this is all quite tactical. There are some big long-term risks coming, especially how to manage China in the long term, its dominance of supply chains and economic ties that the UK badly needs. It's increasingly willing to manipulate or weaponize those ties. And there's long-term questions about where America goes actually after Trump. He absorbs so much oxygen managing the relationship with him day to day that the question of what kind of Republican Party emerges after him and what kind of Democratic Party, and will they have a very different sense of the economic role America should play in the world? All of these are big long-term challenges.
But as you say, so far, so managerial, but he's done it with some style. Stephen, you're interim director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. What do you make of what Keir Starmer has managed to get from the world stage?
Well, the big thing from our side is tariffs, of course, and the tariff relief that he managed to negotiate with President Trump. That could have been much worse, in fact, than it's turned out to be for us. But the thing that worries me is that despite the good signs with the US, we're still outside of the EU and we haven't made enough progress in sort of reducing the barriers that came as a result of Brexit. And that is where the big gains are, because the EU remain our largest trading partner by a long way.
And what about the deals with the EU? Is that going to give the growth that he wants? And what about China?
Well, they will help, but not by much, I think, is the quick answer to that. I think really to get the growth, I think we need to be firmly embedded in the EU single market. Politically, I suspect that's going to be a tough ask over any time soon. But that's really where we need to go if we're going to get the growth through trade. Getting growth internally, that relies on public investment. And that's been an area where we've seen a bit of an increase in investment, but we run into those fiscal rules, which I suspect we'll be talking about later.
Joe, you're a pollster with Deltapoll. What do you make of all this? I mean, the pictures have looked great with Keir Starmer on the world stage with other leaders. Bits of growth, as Stephen's describing, maybe coming through. But we haven't really touched on some of the big conflicts out there. Ukraine, Gaza. What has Keir Starmer done on all this?
Well, for Keir Starmer, the good news is that, generally speaking, foreign policy has been an area of strength for the Labour Party and for the government. And it's not really one of those years where you can point to many great strengths. So it's a bit of good news. The bad news is that no government ever won an election based on foreign policy. That's the reality that they face. When I say it's generally a good news story, it is mixed. On the trade agreements, for instance, consistently around about 6 out of 10 to 2/3 of people agree that the trade agreements are a good thing. Now, the reality is that most people aren't picking through the detail of these things, but the fact that, broadly speaking, the narratives are positive is good for the government. The relationship with the United States and Keir Starmer's management of that, at least so far, has been something that's been viewed positively by the public. Again, the reality is that Donald Trump, as we know, can turn on a sixpence, and so something that's viewed very positively could go very badly very quickly. But so far, it's been positive. The difficulty has been Gaza. On Ukraine and Russia, very positive on Keir Starmer's position, actually continuing the positivity that Rishi Sunak had as well. But Gaza has been a point of difficulty, and part of that is the complexity and evolving nature of the situation. Actually, almost overwhelmingly, most people agree with, if you like, the overall aim of stopping the fighting and minimising civilian deaths. There's relatively few people in this country who don't support that particular overall approach. But it does get complicated when it comes to the degree to which the different sides are quote-unquote supported. Supported in terms of rhetoric, supported in terms of
I've had people
out there
close to him, Labour MPs close to him and very sympathetic to him, saying, look, he wanted to do so much at the beginning to distance the Labour Party from anti-Semitism that he really wanted to knock that on the head emphatically, but now wants to get to a position where he can be more critical of what Israel is doing. And they feel that the position actually is of the Labour Party is migrating that way, or of the government is migrating that way. It has been much more critical of what the Israeli government is doing in Gaza. It has begun to bring sanctions against individual Israeli ministers, whatever. And we're hearing quite a bit that there may be more to come on that.
And I would say that generally speaking, the public is moving towards supporting that position. But of course, it's attracting far less attention now than it was in previous months. The difficulty that Keir Starmer perhaps has is that though overall the country is generally moving more towards alignment with the government's position on this, among certain pockets of the population, it's as important as it ever was, and it's moving away from the government's position. And those are pockets on both sides of the argument. Some of those are in very important Labour seats. Some of those are represented by quite vocal Labour MPs. And so it remains a thorn in the side. What I think the government can hope for at best is that the situation is resolved quickly and that we are seen as a country that is supporting peace.
Well, I think many people, not just the government, would like that to happen. That has not been the record overnight, I have to say, just as we're recording, where there have been more Israeli bombing and more deaths. This is not a podcast, though, about Gaza. Let's come back, though, because the pull of gravity is impossible to resist, to the problems the government's been having at home in the past few weeks. And we've seen this series of U-turns very dramatically in Parliament, where MPs were finally asked to vote on a welfare bill that represented 2 of the original 16 pages, the rest having been ripped up and discarded. But also U-turns on things like language, about migration, and really a whole cascade of things. Stephen, what's your sense of why the government has ended up in this position just a year on from this extraordinary landslide?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of it is economics combined with politics. The Chancellor is in a very, very difficult position in that she has these fiscal rules in place, which mean that she either, in order to meet them, has to cut spending or increase taxes.
That is meaning she can't reach for the third lever, which is borrowing, because, and you could argue over the fiscal rules whether they should be exactly this or exactly that, but basically at some point the market starts saying, as they said to Liz Truss, we don't think we want to lend money to you cheaply anymore.
That's exactly right. If you are going to increase spending via borrowing, you have to convince the markets. You have to come up with a credible plan saying this is what I'm going to do and this is how it's going to pay off. Now, to my mind, she could have done that right after the election. If the Chancellor had come in and said, look, we've discovered this black hole in the accounts. We also have this growth plan that we want to put into place. To do that, we have to invest now, immediately, and we're going to see the growth plan, the growth come in time for the next 5-10 years. Then I think the markets would have been more willing, shall we say, to entertain the prospect of lending to her. But the fact she did not do that immediately, but rather sort of doubled down on the fiscal rules, means it's actually much harder to do that now. So if borrowing is taken out of the equation, then again, if you run into the fiscal rules, you either have to spend less or you have to tax more. And again, we run into the problem that the manifesto, and ever since, the government has said we are not going to raise the 3 big taxes of employee negs, VAT and income tax. Well, the trouble is, if you're not going to raise any of those, you can tinker and tinker as much as you want, but you're not going to effectively be able to raise that much money through increased taxes. So you're then left with you have to cut spending. And this is what led to the extraordinary scenes that we've seen in Parliament over the past week. You know, that part of the welfare bill was to overall cut spending on welfare, but to do it in a way that sort of made the system more efficient, if you like. But just the fact that there were cuts there was enough to generate the discontent among the party that led to the extraordinary scenes that we saw.
I must ask you, do you think it was that there were cuts at all, or was it that they were cuts that hadn't been thought out or affected this group or that group?
I think the trouble with cuts is that you will always affect some group.
Someone is going to lose. That is the definition of them.
Exactly. I thought the bill had been actually fairly well thought out. I think the big problem came with the initial reversal last Friday night, where in order to try and find a compromise, they didn't really think through what the compromise should be. And of course, the result of that was that they had to make a further change to the bill to actually get it through.
And it was a complete mess. Olivia, we had a version of this debate on a panel this week. You were on the panel, and we were indeed talking about Labour a year on. And Lawrence Freedman was making exactly the point that Stephen has just made here, saying they should have raised one of these big taxes right at the beginning. And Emily Thornberry, the Labour MP who's head of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the Commons, said, no, we couldn't do that because the voters would never forgive us, even if, she didn't go on to say, but even if the markets did. You were sitting there. What did you make of that?
I mean, I think it's sort of symptomatic of the way Labour really box themselves in. They have such a history of being concerned about being seen as the profligate party that they set a number of red lines before the election on tax, as you said, but also on things like the relationship with the EU, for example. So they said in their manifesto that they wouldn't join the single market, the customs union, or accept freedom of movement. There are so many ways in which they do face a really difficult domestic and geopolitical context, but they also somewhat put themselves in a difficult position by making sort of promises before the election that mean the levers they could pull to get themselves out of this situation are somewhat out of reach. And I think they're very concerned about exactly the option we've been discussing, which is could they level with the voters at some point, maybe just after they were elected, or maybe at the point when people were particularly concerned about, say, Trump's commitment to NATO and European security when they raised defence spending in February.
A big shock to the world.
Absolutely.
Big news. They could reasonably have said the world has changed.
Yeah, could they have said things are so difficult that we need to shift and hope that people would understand and go with them?
Joe, this is a portrait of a government terrified of the voters, of its own MPs.
Yes, I mean, that's certainly one characterisation. In another way, it's a continuation of this Ming Vase strategy that was talked about so much in the run-up to the last election, not wanting to scare the horses, with the horses being everyone from MPs to the general public to the bond markets. And so it does get extremely complicated. I think part of the problem, I think, is a matter of timing. The election, of course, was a surprise to most of us, certainly was to me. We expected maybe May, perhaps November or something like that, but very few people expected July. But I'm increasingly of the opinion that if you want to ruin an incoming government, holding an election in July that you're pretty sure you're going to lose is the way to do that, because the Labour Party attached so much importance to things like the OBR. The Office of Budget Responsibility would have to pass judgment on our new economic plans. We can't just announce things. And you hold an election in July, and what happens? Almost immediately, you're going on recess. You have the summer holidays. You have people away because they have holidays in the summer. You have people away because they've just worked an election campaign and they're completely exhausted. You can't get things signed off. You can't get things through. And your first 100 days basically takes you to the party conference season. And whereas, to use an extreme example, Donald Trump with Project 2025 was able to use the quote, flood the zone in his first 100 days. Really, there was very little that came out for Labour during that time. Yes, there was an announcement that there was continual announcements of essentially misery, that things are worse than we ever expected. Well, that's never going to play well with the general public. And then also you have things like the issues over freebies, the announcement on winter fuel, the announcement on farmers and inheritance tax. All of those were, to my mind, a demonstration of a party that had not yet got to grips with the fact that it was in government and the implications of that. And in the same way, you could be critical of the Conservatives and say they perhaps still haven't got to grips with the fact that they're in opposition and the implications of that. And so all of this laid a very difficult foundation for any government, but particularly difficult for Labour in the situation that it was
Absolutely. And you can say that Keir Starmer perhaps didn't understand how much his government was going to be defined by these economic rules and choices, and so subcontracted too much to Rachel Reeves. And then she, following those rules, had to pick off all these things that affected farmers or winter fuel payments, and so had this great chorus of people who are losing out from those particular things rising up against her. If we move to now, though, do you think they could be bolder? And because they're coming up to another budget in the autumn, in October, can they now say to voters, look, OK, things really are worse than we thought, and risk saying that now and raise some of the big taxes?
I think a lot depends on the economic measures. The vast majority of people in this country are not paying attention to the specifics of announcements, even when it comes to something as important as the budget. There are many talking points that have occurred over the last year, but there are very few turning points. And instead, people out there, the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street, are paying attention to narratives, broad narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves and each other when it comes to the government's economic policy. Are their priorities correct? Are they doing the right thing? Are they effective? Can they deliver? Are they operating in a fair way? All of those are the broad stories. And I think that part of the issue the government has is that the economic indicators have not been great. If there is an improvement, for instance, in growth, if there is a decline in inflation, if there is a fall in interest rates, that, if you like, sets a picture of the government is moving things in the right direction. And so therefore, there's the potential for adjustments. But the difficulty they have is it's a tightrope in public opinion terms. At the national level, when you ask people, just in the broadest terms, should we increase taxes and spending? Should we keep them as they are at the moment? Or should we reduce spending and reduce taxes? You get around about a third of people saying keep them as they are at the moment. You have around a third of people saying increase spending and increase taxes. And that's true at a national level, that division basically down the middle. But it's also true among Labour supporters and among Labour MPs. And so it's not the case that at a national level people are divided, but among any one party, overwhelmingly they favour one approach or another. So you're inevitably going to upset a constituency in
this is
both
a fascinating point, Joe. This is a
points.
really fascinating point. First place, the government can't then go and govern by the polls, as governments are sometimes, when they're panicked, want to do. But also it may be very hard to get a majority for anything it wants to do. Stephen, there were a whole load of ifs, a cascade of ifs that Joe was saying in that. Where do you think those ifs are going to line up?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think that the government are going to be helped out over the coming year. I think growth this year is not going to be good. I mean, part of that is resulting directly from the rises in NICs and the national minimum wage. That
NICs being the national insurance contribution of employers.
Exactly. Inflation has picked up again to 3.5%. It's probably going to stay around about there for the rest of the year, and the risks are always to the upside. If anything worse happens in the Middle East than is going on already, then you might expect problems with oil supplies. That'll affect energy prices, and that feed through pretty quickly onto inflation as a whole. So inflation is going to be in that 3.5% region for this year and could rise potentially if things go badly wrong. As a result of that, the falls in interest rates that we're expecting to see over the next 2 years are going to be much smaller. Maybe one more cut this year, maybe one cut next year. So all the good news things that the government wants to happen, they're going to have to wait a bit for that.
Olivia, you mentioned the question that other countries are struggling with these same things. Many of them in Europe, ageing populations, lots of debt boosted by coronavirus, and trying to persuade their publics to take money out of welfare and put it into defence and things they haven't thought about for a long time. How much do you see this as just a general problem, not particularly a problem of this government's handling?
I think it is a relatively general problem because this week has been dramatic in terms of the Westminster politics of it all. There's been a lot of discussion about maybe the government needs to make personnel changes, bring in a new chancellor. I have to say, looking at it in a broader context, I'm not sure what a different chancellor or a different arrangement of the government's cabinet would mean or would do about some of these larger challenges. The UK, like a lot of other European countries, has an expensive welfare state and it needs to spend more on defence. In the 70s and 80s, we were spending around 4% of GDP on both, on health and defence. Now we're at around 8 to 9% of GDP on health. And the one thing the government has said that it will spend more on is defence. We now have this NATO target for 2035 of 5% of GDP on defence, made up of 3.5% on hard defence, military personnel and things like that, and 1.5% on this rather vague category of security and resilience, whatever that will turn out to mean.
But anyway, tens of billions of pounds more.
Tens of billions of pounds more. And I think while the signs are that the public feels we are in a more dangerous environment and there was initially support for that extra defence spending, I think it will be difficult for this government to continue to tell a story that this is one of the few things we have money for when there are so many needs elsewhere and demography is against us. An ageing population means without reform, that welfare state will only get more expensive, and there are pretty limited prospects for the world to get calmer and for those calls on defence spending to reduce. I think there's a couple of other sort of broader challenges as well, which is this question of the capacity of the state to get things done. You see people on the US left talking about this a lot.
Well, it's a very abstract term. What do you mean by that? Britain doesn't work, that kind of thing.
And people are frustrated about things like we can't build a train line or when it comes to things like defence spending, right? this rush to spend more, we have to get that right. It has to actually produce results. And our record in terms of defence procurement and in that area is really poor. So I think this government is wrestling with a slightly bigger problem than who does what in the cabinet, which is that they're somewhat frustrated that when they pull on the levers of government, they struggle to get the outcomes that they want, which is a challenge because, as everybody always says here at Chatham House, people always use the phrase we're in a competitive age. And I think to unpack...
Do they? Anyway,
well, to unpack what they mean by that, right, there are other countries with other systems, not liberal democracies, who seem like they deliver more for their populations. It's a blow to kind of our...
I guess at the big scale it's the challenge. Look, could a dictator run this better? We're not quite at that point, Joe, at which point your trade would be redundant, I guess. But
Oh, no, on the contrary. I mean, if you're the dictator's official pollsters,
all right, there's a whole well-known line of work in there.
On its own.
There is a whole career for you and your family in that, but we're not there yet. Is Britain governable in the sense of politicians being able to get support for the things that they need to do, the tough decisions that Olivia was describing?
The difficulty that all developed democracies have faced, going back 20 years now, if not further, but it's a problem that accelerated after COVID, is that the challenges and the questions that need to be answered are enormous. It's very, very difficult to provide simple, effective solutions in government quickly to these enormous problems. And this is by no means, as I say, unique to Britain. And the difficulty that a lot of established democracies have is that there are now these insurgent movements. Sometimes it will be individuals, sometimes it will be parties, sometimes it will be campaign groups and pressure groups, and usually a combination of all three, where the solution actually is presented as simple and is presented as straightforward, usually involving the persecution or otherwise of other groups, of other people, of other countries, however you want to characterise it, take your pick. And the degree to which, of course, that could actually be delivered is another matter, but it has a certain appeal to certain sections of the population. And in some cases, the frustrations that people have with the current system are not without merit. If you're under 40, and particularly if you're not university educated, and particularly if you live in a larger city, your chance of buying your own home is vanishingly small. And if you can't buy your own home, you are at the mercy of potentially unscrupulous landlords. It's more difficult to think about having children and schooling and all these sorts of things. And there's no obvious solution to that. Various suggestions have been made by successive governments about what could be done, and tinkering has been made around the edges. But to use just that as one of many examples, it's an issue for which there really is no obvious solution, and understandably, people are frustrated about that.
I'm trying to think, as we're sitting here, of countries that have handled this really well. And I came back fairly recently from Greece, an economics conference, I should say, not lying in the 37-degree heat. Struck by just the changes they have managed to make to their system, including pensions and taxes and all kinds of things, but obviously off the back of a horrendous crisis that plunged people into poverty, and then they've managed to repair quite a bit of that, still not in an entirely comfortable place. But quiet years of a technocratic government following a crisis managed to do something. But, Stephen, it is difficult for any government to respond to this, isn't it? What would you advise the Chancellor to do? And the Prime Minister, I guess. It goes beyond her.
I mean, as an economist, the answer for me is relatively straightforward. They have to go to the bond markets and say, look, we have this plan. We need to do this investment, in particular in defence, etc. We need to raise further funding on the bond markets. And we can only do that if we change or alter or suspend or something the fiscal rules. At the same time, to convince the bond markets that they're credible with that, I think they would have to commit to raising one of the big taxes. I would suggest maybe 1% or 2% on income tax on the basic rate. I can't see either of those things happening given the current political climate. And that makes the whole thing very, very difficult. I think that they are doing what they can do within the very, very tight constraints that Olivia reminded us that they'd set themselves. The publication of the industrial policy and the trade policy, the investment that they are doing in areas the relaxation of planning laws, which I guess is one of the ways of getting at the problem that was raised just a minute ago on housing. I think they're all kind of good things, but they're not going to shift the dial unless they either or both come up with some solution to borrowing more and raise taxes.
As you said, a lot of reviews, which are all coming to a head in this period, just a year on from the election. And we did ask them, in fact, asked Rachel Reeves the day the election was called, can't you do these reviews in opposition? She said, no, we don't get access to the figures. These reviews are coming through, but it's a reminder of how long governments can take to get into their stride, and the public and polls and markets are not giving them that time. Well, we're coming to the end. We've got that then prescription from Stephen to look forward to. More taxes in some form, and from the government, I guess, we're doing the best we can. It has been quite a year. We're going to have to stop there, but we will keep very much on this subject. I'd like to thank Olivia Sullivan, Stephen Millard, Joe Twyman, and do keep following our events page on our website. We have a lot on, particularly next week. It's the time of year when a lot of foreign ministers and ambassadors come through town, and we've got a stream of those coming. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, do leave us a review. Our producer this week was Amanda Nunn. I'm Bronwen Maddox. See you next week.